Hey everybody, this is Aaron the Pedantic. So I felt like I wanted to do a video today on something that I've been thinking about for some time. One of the things that I often end up at odds with people about is my process for creating characters in Dungeons and Dragons. So this is something that I probably picked up due to the fact that I'm mostly a DM. But whenever I'm a player, a lot of times whenever I generate my characters, they tend to be very archetypal. And this is something that a lot of people these days are kind of at odds with. The archetypes tend to be looked at as tropes, which are things that should be subverted because of the fact that subverting tropes makes things more interesting in the perspectives of a lot of people. And this can be the case at times. It can be a refreshing change of pace to have something turned on its head. But at the same time, there's a lot of very important things that archetypes offer. They are often something that it feels familiar. And because of that, a lot of times we can kind of feel the contrast more whenever they start to be deeper characters. And ultimately, whenever you're playing D&D, your characters are going to grow in depth as you play, because of the fact that they are not just static characters. They are dynamic. They're going to, have experiences. They're going to grow from them in a lot of cases. Some games that's not the case, but most of them they will. And then so the archetype just serves as a starting point. In a lot of ways, it's something that tends to be very endearing. So these are things that are just incredibly familiar through like literature, through movies, just, anytime that we tell a story as human beings, there tends to be these archetypes. They are a reflection of just familiar types of characters that we use. So I tend to start with that whenever I'm coming up with a new character. Shut up, computer. I don't know if you heard that. I start with that. And so, like, typically, because of the fact that I tend to want to play old school D&D, usually I roll my stats in a row, 3d6, 6 times. And then after that, like, I'll just kind of see what this character looks like they're going to be good at. I usually don't move the stats around. This is something that's easier with the older editions because stats are a lot less important. There's some debates to be. Oh my God, computer! If you don't shut the fuck up, I'm actually gonna let me mute that. Okay. There are arguments to be made. For instance, in AD&D, you literally have to roll under your stat for ability checks. So that is pretty significant at that point. Even just 1 point makes a significant difference. When in 5th edition, a lot of times it's 2 points makes a significant difference. And really not terribly that significant of a difference. The swinginess kind of tends to matter more, and your proficiency and all those kinds of things. So there are arguments to be made, but there are a lot of less situations where a class ability is going to be severely hindered by your stats. There will be occasions where that does happen, but they're few and far between. My cleric, for instance, has a very basic wisdom score. So basic, indeed, that he has a chance of failure whenever he casts a spell, but it's only 10%. So most of the time, it doesn't really, cause any trouble. So far, I've only had it mess up a spell casting 1 time. And it wasn't really at a time where it really mattered. It was just like, oh shit, now I lost that spell for the day. Oh well. But generally speaking, the stats aren't quite as important. So it's a little bit easier to get away with. In 5th edition, a lot of builds are very dependent on having very specific stats. Some of them require more than others. For instance, a fighter can often get away with just having a pretty good strength and a decent con. And that's really about it, because they can use heavy armor to, deal with the, ramifications of X thing or whatever. On the contrary, whenever you look at a barbarian, for instance, if they're going to be an unarmored fighter, they're going to need a high constitution, they're going to need a high dexterity, and a high strength. If you're a monk, you're going to need dexterity and wisdom, and you can probably just get away with that. That's kind of like the general how things work. So stats are a little bit more important. You wouldn't want to have a high strength, high wisdom, high charisma character necessarily. You might be able to make that work as a paladin or something like that, but you'd kind of be missing out on what could be more constitution so that you're tougher. Maybe some more dexterity so that you have better initiative, stuff like that. So it tends to not be as big of an issue in older games. But because I can get away with that a lot of times, I roll it, I see like, okay, I've got a high dexterity score, so it's probably going to be a thief. So then at that point, I have some archetypes that I can kind of play with. That kind of can help me get an idea for their personality. And a lot of the personality is going to fall into place because of the familiarity of the archetypes. So the obvious thing for a thief would be perhaps the outlaw. So the outlaw is an archetype that is basically, I'm going to do what's good for me. I'm not really so concerned about what society wants from me or anything like that. I'm just going to kind of look out for number one, usually. So oftentimes that means that they're going to be at odds with the law. Perfect for a thief, all those kinds of things. But you can also use, for instance, the explorer. So the explorer is one that is going to be very curious, very restless. They're often going to want to go off and do things and to see new sights. They have wanderlust to high, levels. So like they're each one of these has like kind of an inherent flaw to it. The explorer is really not going to want to say no whenever there's another room to check. Because who knows? This could be where they're going to find the tablet that has, the lost history of an ancient tribe that maybe holds the secret to, releasing a curse on this exquisite treasure or something like that. All that kind of stuff is going to kind of play off of that. There are just tons of different ways that you can incorporate this. And it's like, take your class and then like use kind of an archetype on top of it. And the archetype doesn't have to have any kind of mechanical features or anything like that. It just kind of explains what kind of person you're playing as. And people will recognize it as they play. And then they'll be like, well, I have a pretty good idea of what this character is going to do. And, it will throw them for a loop whenever you do otherwise. But whenever you kind of go along with the archetype, then a lot of times people find it endearing. And here's the really important thing. This is a really smart way to go if you're playing a game of D&D where the death count can be very high. Because of the fact that you often hear people say, I need a backstory because the backstory helps me decide what their personality is, their outlook on the world, all these kinds of things. So they spend a lot of time developing this backstory. They fall absolutely in love with this character. And then whenever the time comes that their character might die, they really just don't want it to happen. And for a lot of us that play D&D, that's kind of why we play the game, is to have life or death situations and to try and take risks and get the big payoff. And, if our characters die, then that's just part of the game. So it really kind of behooves people to maybe start with something a little bit more simplistic and then grow from there. So again, to go back to my character, Richard the cleric, basically whenever I created him, he had a name, he had a general appearance, he had a kind of personality. Part of his personality was determined by his attributes. Basically, he has a 5 intelligence. In AD&D, it means that he shouldn't be literate. But because of the fact that he's a cleric, he kind of has to be literate. So we kind of adopted a Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia kind of perspective, where he kind of he can read kind of, and whenever he writes, it's kind of hieroglyphics almost. But in any case, so I really hadn't even thought about anything to do with like who he was prior to meeting the group. It really just wasn't something that was terribly important. It's one of those things where if somebody were to ask in the middle of play, hey, Richard, tell me about your past, then usually I would be able to just kind of BS it with what I have learned about the world so far, and kind of what would explain what's going on. So really, I guess this is probably something that someone who is more skilled with improvising on the spot is going to find more success. But I still believe that most people can probably get away with this just fine. So this is part of the reason why I really don't put a lot of stock in the need for backstories. Backstories are really good for mining details, so that you can use things from that will heighten the tension in a game. So as a DM, you can use a contact that they might have had, or a family member, or a friend, or a lover, something to that effect. You can use that to kind of heighten the tension of the game and make things a little bit more intense. But aside from that, if you're playing the kind of game that I'm really currently very interested in, a lot of that kind of stuff isn't really going to, be a big focus at all, really. Most characters that we have are kind of they're doing the adventuring business because they really don't have much else left. Either they're kind of like their family is like either gone or dead, or something has caused them to separate from their family. There's a reason that they left everything behind. They're putting their lives on the line for payment or for glory or something to that effect. So it's really not something that comes up that often. We really focus on the adventure itself rather than all those kind of periphery details. And we have a damn good time doing it. I will acknowledge that this is not how a lot of people play still, I would think. It seems to be kind of the current popularity, the current hotness to basically have these very interwoven backstory campaign situations where the campaign is really, it's an adventure that's going on for a long time, but it's also going to incorporate stuff from characters' backstories and try and have character arcs and all these kinds of things. And it really doesn't translate well with my style of play. Although it can be enjoyable. I have done such things before and it was enjoyable. It's just not really what we typically want to focus on, because we want to have games that are very lethal, where there's a very high chance that you're going to die if you make a poor decision. And because of that, the characters are going to be very self-motivated in a lot of cases. They might have a heroic bone in them, but it's going to be one of those situations where they know that they're probably going to die if they go through with whatever. And they might be the only ones in the group that are going to go along with it. The rest might say, sorry, this isn't what I signed up for. I'm here to get the money and get out. And if that happens, then that's just how it goes. And it's kind of an entertaining thing. A lot of times it's like, well, my character just had this heroic death. Time to roll up a new one, but a lot of times the player isn't ready to throw them away. So that doesn't happen terribly often, but it can, really heighten the situation whenever you have those circumstances where someone, is going to have to take a fall, or else everyone is going to die probably. And so that makes the sacrifices really, really powerful, whenever those happen. I'm kind of deviating off of the main topic, but this is all just me trying to explain why it could be useful to start with an archetype and work forward from that point, especially considering the fact that the low levels are whenever you're really vulnerable. So, like, why have this extensive backstory just to start with? A lot of times, for me, it's better just to have the campaign start, and usually kind of like in media res, or like basically everyone's gathered, they've already kind of like signed on to work together, and then they're undertaking this mission for whatever their personal reasons are. And then those kinds of things start to branch outward as we play and become more and more complex and significant. So if you are going to try and utilize these archetypes, then I'm going to just take a little bit of time to explain them a little bit. So the hero archetype, and by the way, before I get onto that, I'm aware of the Joseph Campbell archetypes, but I'm not using them specifically because most of them tend to be rooted in a story structure rather than just a character type. What I mean by that is they have narrative purposes rather than just being archetypal characters that just kind of exist. So, for instance, the Herald in the Joseph Campbell archetypes is basically the one that's going to make things happen for the story, and that's not really relevant for D&D most of the time. I mean, that might be relevant for an NPC, and that's something to be considered. But for the purposes of player characters, or just regular NPCs, it's not really that important. And I would say that this is better for D&D than the Joseph Campbell ones. I would kind of put the Joseph Campbell ones on for more story-oriented games. Doesn't mean you can't play D&D like a story game, but it's not how I like it. Anyway, so the hero is someone who's going to be guided by principles. They have kind of like a higher purpose. They are courageous. They're also often very prideful. Hubris is going to be the thing that often leads to their downfall, if they have a downfall, which they often do, because that's more interesting than just not having anything bad happen. It doesn't mean that they can't recover from it, but usually setbacks are going to be triggered by events of hubris. The lover. So the lover is one that's going to follow their heart in such cheesy terms, but they are more than that. I would say they're kind of naive. They are going to follow their feelings, and it's going to put other things in bad positions a lot of times. So as you can tell already, these archetypes often have flaws attached to them that allow you to play your character in a way that adds to the tension of the game. So the lover is one that's often going to put themselves at risk for people that they really care about. Probably a good example would be like Romeo, even though I don't want to go there. Romeo from Romeo and Juliet, because of the fact that he's so swept up in this whole thing of love. He just can't bear being without his lady. He just wants to die at that point, and it makes for an interesting archetype. Someone that's so swept up into their emotions that they do things that are just rash and ridiculous to onlookers. The lover's an interesting one. The outlaw is I think I went over that a little bit. They're going to create problems for the rest because of the fact that they are less concerned with what is expected of them. They would rather do what is good for them. The gambler is one that is not often used except for in Westerns, but I'm including it because of the fact that I think it's a very great archetype. So the gambler obviously is a reference to gambling, which obviously comes to mind, dice, cards, that kind of thing. But the gambler is also going to be gambling with just life in general. So this would include someone who's very entrepreneurial, someone who is a risk taker who follows their intuition, who tries to capitalize on their luck when they've got it. and then whenever whenever the cards fall against their favor, they often suffer tremendously. A good influence for that would be John Oakhurst from The Outcasts at Poker Flat, which is a story by Bret Hart. Anyway, or Doc Holliday, more appropriately, Tombstone. Definitely watch it. I love that fucking movie. The magician is clearly Gandalf, someone who is exceptionally powerful, who has like a lot of knowledge. They know a lot. They have a lot of power. Because of this, they're often very corruptible. So usually whenever they don't end up being a bad guy, they're usually the kind of person who is kind of neutral in almost all things. So again, Gandalf comes to mind. Merlin comes to mind, even though Merlin did some really stupid, fucked up shit. If you read I can't think of the author's name, but his version of the King Arthur stories, the one that's most commonly referred. Another one that comes to mind is Saruman. He's the one who clearly gives in to the corruption. He thinks that he can do best with the power that's going to be used by Sauron to kind of handle things, and because of that, he's easily corrupted. So a lich is obviously a magician archetype. A lot of times whenever I use a lich in my campaigns, they are typically either just, completely full of themselves, and they're just like, I don't give a shit about anybody else. I've got all this power. Who cares? Or what I tend to like to do is they have some kind of problem that they know about that they're trying to deal with that requires them to do horrible things in order to gain the appropriate power to deal with that problem. And meanwhile, nobody else really knows about that problem, and they just think that this person's just evil and fucked up. It's a nice twist, and it can leave the players in an interesting dilemma. The everyman. So this is one that's not going to fit in so often with player characters in a lot of games, but whenever you are able to make it work, it can be really cool. Obviously, it would work best for like a hireling, like maybe or someone that you rescue that becomes a tag along or something like that. There's somebody who is just kind of salt of the earth, everyday person, and because of the fact that they are so plain, compared to everybody else, the juxtaposition between them and everything else that's happening is incredible, and a lot of times creates the opportunity for massive growth as a character. There's someone who's just going to watch things unfold and do what they can, and then they're going to be just blown away by the things that they're being involved in. So the explorer, I think I already went into that. The sage is, to me, the best sage would probably be like Yoda. So there's someone that is just full of wisdom. They're full of the right advice at the right time. If you've ever seen the movie Waiting, there's a character on Waiting called Bishop. So Bishop is, I want to say that he washes dishes. They're basically wait staff at a restaurant. And the characters often go to Bishop to talk about their problems, and he'll give them this fantastic advice that's often like not even him telling them what to do or anything like that, but they know what to do with the advice a lot of times, or he knows how to interpret their problems. This is a sage character, so they're very interesting to have. They make great druids, great clerics in the right circumstance. My cleric is more of a zealot, so he would probably fall more under the hero, I would say. But most people probably wouldn't call him that. So the creator is probably going to be most fitting for a bard or an artificer, because of the fact the creator is someone who is obsessed with owning their craft and being someone who makes wondrous things. So And you can use this in many different ways in different games, but I'm just thinking in terms of D&D. So like a creator might be a scientist, like a Dr. Frankenstein kind of person, or it could be someone who's trying to cure cancer. Maybe a lot of times I feel like the creator would make a good Call of Cthulhu character because of the fact that they're delving into the parts of the world that you really shouldn't, whatever you've got the great old ones. But as far as D&D goes, the creator is someone who is very aloof. They're going to kind of not be so concerned about what most of everyone else is doing. So my bard that I'm playing in 5th edition game right now, he kind of falls under the creator because he's all obsessed about the craft, creating the songs, being able to take history and turn it into things that people can, just appreciate and love. He's basically very self-absorbed in this pursuit. It doesn't mean that you can't be altruistic with your desires to create in whatever capacity, but typically the creator is someone who is going to be kind of a problem for the groups every now and then because of the fact that they aren't going to pass an opportunity to do the thing that they need to do to further their creations, while they also are going to be a little bit less invested in the things that the others are doing. They're not going to be the most heroic a lot of times, unless there's something that they really need from the situation. The ruler. So the ruler is a very easy one to fit into a D&D campaign because of the concept of backgrounds. So there is such a thing as the noble background. The ruler is just, it doesn't have to be like a king or a prince or a queen or, an emperor or anything like that. They just need to be somebody who is in charge of people. So a noble is going to fall into that because of the fact that they are going to have an estate. They're going to have people that are expected to be their subordinates that have to respond to them in a certain way. The ruler doesn't have to be, like a pompous asshole that treats everyone like shit. That's kind of a trope that is very strong these days, but from most of what I understand, history has been like. Nobility kind of needed to treat their people well, usually. It's just that they had a different conception of justice in a lot of ways. So the peasants were responsible for keeping the other peasants in line. So whenever one person among them did something wrong, everyone would get punished. And that it was harsh. I'm not going to lie, it was harsh. But at the same time, the nobility was expected to take care of the peasants. They would provide for them. They would protect them. If you read about how the life of a knight was, the tales, from King Arthur and all that make it sound a lot more glamorous than it really was. They were people that were constantly on the move, constantly fighting, constantly killing, having to do pretty rough things in order to try and take care of everyone else. So whenever you have these romanticized versions, it was inspiring, but at the same time, it didn't really represent a lot of what they were going through. Poor nobles, right? And I can already hear the screeching. But yeah, so the ruler is they're a lot of times they're going to be benevolent in their own way, or they're going to be horribly despotic. You could be anywhere on that whole region, but one of the real common things is you tend to be kind of holier than thou in a lot of your ways. But you need the support of the people around you. So when push comes to shove, that you rely on the support of your subordinates, and you will take care of them. So you will make the necessary calls to make stuff happen. You will make appropriate sacrifices, whether that is typically the sacrifices of other people, because the people need you, right? So the ruler makes for a very interesting character to have in a D&D troop. Although I would say that there's got to be a pretty good reason for them to be involved in whatever, bullshittery this is. So this probably wouldn't be the kind of character I would often have in a plain ass dungeon delving game. This would be probably more for a political game or for, I guess, like a heroic quest kind of thing. That kind of deal. The caregiver. So the caregiver this is pretty obvious. This is really a pretty solid thing for the real mushy clerics, or it could really fall in and under like a druid would be a great one. Really, there are all kinds of ways that you can incorporate the caregiver, but there's someone who is just there's somebody that or some kind of people, or maybe every person, they want to look after and protect and take care of and help and soothe their problems. And so they're often very selfless in this endeavor. Because of that, they're often going to be the martyr in a lot of cases. They are going to put themselves on the line for the people they care about. And that's really the extent of it. So they tend to not really take care of themselves as a result. Finally, we have the jester. Now, the jester doesn't have to literally be a clown. There have been many characters that would fall under the jester archetype throughout literature, throughout movies, all those kinds of things. They are just going to be a character that is kind of wild, kind of exotic, unpredictable, and oftentimes funny. So it's one of those things that requires kind of a measured approach, because sometimes you don't want to play a game where there's always a character that is always cracking jokes. And if it's too overbearing, it can get frustrating. All we have to do is think back to playing Skyrim, and we think back to Cicero. Cicero was a great character to have around for a little bit, but if he stuck around too long, dear God, you just want to kill him. And this is really not terribly different. So the jester makes for great NPC or henchman or something like that, and it can make for a great PC given the opportunity. But it's not really the you just have to be careful with it. You want to, like I said, have a measured approach. So they're often going to be funny. They can be kind of grating. And a lot of times they're going to make diplomacy kind of an interesting endeavor. Sometimes they can break the ice by being their weird selves and kind of like taking a very tense situation and bringing it down. Or they can do it the complete opposite direction, where, you have some diplomacy going on and then someone is incredibly offended by something that the jester does and they totally fuck it up. So the jester can do a lot of things to enrich all of this. So I think that covers all the ones that really come to mind right now. I'm sure that people will probably think of more. There are some that are probably more what I would say stock character types, like the heartless mercenary, or stuff like that could probably be considered archetypes if you take them and let them grow. Yeah. So I hope that this was interesting. At the very least, it might put some perspective into my character creation process. Because of the fact that a lot of people put a whole lot of stock into their backstories, they tend to be kind of shocked whenever I say, well, my backstory is usually like less than a paragraph. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. We have a lovely weekend coming up. So, yeah, that's it for today. Have a good one.